The sound of roaring engines and the screech of tires shattered the stillness of the night, pulling Jack Reynolds from his restless sleep. The retired Marine, now in his late 50s, had chosen this small rural town for its peace and simplicity, a place to escape the chaos of his past and quietly rebuild his life after losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. His home, a modest house on the edge of town, was more than a shelter. It was a labor of love, each nail and beam a testament to his resilience and determination to start over. But as Jack stumbled out of bed, his instincts honed by years of service screamed that something was wrong. Grabbing the flashlight he kept by the door, he stepped outside, only to find his worst fears realized. His front yard, once meticulously maintained, was littered with shattered glass and empty beer bottles. Graffiti scrawled in bright red paint defaced the side of his house, with crude symbols and the name of a notorious biker gang, the Iron Vultures. His American flag, a symbol of pride and sacrifice, lay crumpled and torn on the ground, smeared with mud. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, the cool night air doing little to temper the heat of his anger. This wasn't just vandalism, it was an attack on everything he stood for. The Iron Vultures had been causing trouble around town for months, but this was personal. Jack had never crossed paths with the gang, refusing to pay their so-called protection fees or sell his land for the development they seemed to covet. Now, it was clear they wanted to send a message. As the initial shock subsided, Jack's training took over. He inspected the damage with the methodical precision that had served him well in combat, noting every detail that might give him an edge. The anger burning in his chest was tempered by a cold, calculated determination. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The next morning, as Jack scrubbed the graffiti off his walls and replaced his flag, he listened to murmurs from his neighbors. The Iron Vultures were untouchable, they said. Too dangerous, too well connected. But Jack wasn't a man to back down from a fight, especially one that threatened his home and his principles. They picked the wrong house, he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. For Jack Reynolds, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, and he knew exactly how to deliver it. Jack Reynolds stood on his front porch, staring at the damage left by the Iron Vultures. His neighbors had been quick to offer their condolences and words of caution, but none of them had dared to stand up to the gang. Jack understood their fear. He had seen the same kind of intimidation tactics during his tours overseas. But this was different. This was his home. Assessing the enemy. Jack spent the next few days quietly gathering information about the Iron Vultures. He learned that the gang was led by Vince "Crusher" Delaney, a man known for his violent temper and ruthless control over his crew. They operated out of a makeshift clubhouse on the outskirts of town, a dilapidated building surrounded by motorcycles and broken-down cars. The gang had grown bold in recent months, shaking down local businesses and threatening residents who refused to comply with their demands. At the same time, Jack noticed patterns in their behavior. They rode in packs, their movements loud and obvious. They relied on fear and brute force, but they weren't careful. They didn't expect resistance, and they certainly didn't expect it from someone like Jack. "They've gotten too comfortable," Jack muttered to himself as he mapped out their territory on his kitchen table. "That's their mistake." Fortifying the house. Jack's military training kicked in as he began transforming his home into a fortress. He reinforced his doors and windows with plywood and steel bars, set up motion sensor lights around the property, and installed cameras to monitor every angle. He even dug shallow trenches in strategic locations around his yard, filling them with sharp debris to slow down anyone who tried to approach. In his garage, Jack unearthed an old duffel bag filled with tools of his trade, zip ties, paracord, and a well-maintained knife he hadn't touched in years. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he wasn't naive. If the Iron Vultures came back, he intended to be ready. The first encounter. It wasn't long before the gang made their next move. Late one night, Jack heard the familiar rumble of engines growing louder. Peering through his window, he saw a group of bikers pulling into his driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack didn't hesitate. He triggered a switch on his wall, activating a series of motion lights that bathed his property in an eerie glow. The sudden illumination startled the bikers, who stopped short, their bravado faltering. "Get off my land," Jack said, stepping out onto the porch with a shotgun resting casually in his hands. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. The gang members exchanged uncertain glances before one of them, a burly man with a shaved head, stepped forward. "You don't scare us, old man," he sneered. Jack didn't flinch. "This is your one warning," he said evenly. "Next time, I won't be so polite." The bikers hesitated before retreating, their engines roaring as they sped away into the night. Jack knew they wouldn't let the humiliation go unanswered, but he felt a grim satisfaction. He had made it clear that he wasn't an easy target. The town's reaction. Word of Jack's standoff spread quickly through the town. Some residents were impressed by his courage, while others feared he was stirring up trouble that would only make things worse. At the diner, Jack overheard conversations about how the Iron Vultures were likely planning their revenge. "You can't fight these guys, Jack," said Megan, the diner's owner, and one of the few people willing to speak openly about the gang. "They don't back down. You should let the cops handle it." Jack shook his head. "The cops won't do anything," he said. "They're too afraid or too bought off. If we don't stand up to them, no one will." Megan sighed, her concern evident. "Just be careful, okay?" Escalation. The Iron Vultures didn't wait long to strike back. A few nights later, they returned in greater numbers, this time with bats and chains. They shattered more windows, tore down Jack's motion lights, and sprayed gasoline across his yard in a menacing display. But Jack had anticipated their escalation. From inside his fortified home, Jack triggered a remote alarm that blared through hidden speakers around the property. The deafening noise disoriented the bikers, forcing them to retreat before they could do more damage. Jack watched from a secure vantage point, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. Recruiting allies. Realizing he couldn't fight the gang alone forever, Jack reached out to the few neighbors who shared his frustration. He began with Megan, who offered her diner as a meeting spot for concerned residents. Slowly, others joined, including Tom, a retired police officer, and Lisa, a shop owner who had been targeted by the gang. Jack trained the group in basic self-defense and situational awareness, sharing strategies he had learned during his years in the military. They formed a makeshift neighborhood watch, coordinating patrols and sharing information about the gang's activities. "This isn't just about me," Jack told them during one meeting. "This is about taking back our town." A bold plan. Jack knew that to truly stop the Iron Vultures, he had to cut the head off the snake. He devised a plan to lure the gang to his property for a final confrontation. Using bait, rumors of a hidden stash of money in his home, he ensured the gang would take the risk of coming in full force. The night of the confrontation, Jack and his allies were ready. He had set up traps throughout his property, tripwires, smoke bombs, and strategically placed barricades. His neighbors stood by to provide backup, armed with cameras to record the gang's actions and evidence for the authorities. The attack begins. As the Iron Vultures roared into his yard, their numbers larger than ever, Jack waited calmly. When they began tearing through his property, he triggered the first trap, a burst of smoke that engulfed the bikers, leaving them coughing and disoriented. From there, it was a calculated series of maneuvers. Jack used his knowledge of the terrain to outflank the gang, isolating smaller groups and neutralizing their attacks. His neighbors held their ground, using their training to fend off the bikers and protect each other. In the chaos, Jack confronted Vince "Crusher" Delaney himself. The gang leader towered over Jack, his presence as intimidating as his reputation. But Jack wasn't fazed. Using his speed and tactical experience, he outmaneuvered Vince, delivering a final blow that left the gang leader incapacitated. The chaos of the night slowly settled as the last of the Iron Vultures' bikes roared away, their riders retreating into the darkness. The once proud gang had been dismantled, their leader, Vince "Crusher" Delaney, left bound on Jack Reynolds' front lawn, bruised and broken, awaiting the arrival of the authorities. Around him, the members of the impromptu neighborhood defense group stood quietly, their faces a mix of exhaustion, relief, and pride. For Jack, the victory was bittersweet. The property he had worked so hard to protect bore the scars of the battle, scorched patches of grass, shattered glass, and the remnants of his carefully laid traps. Yet, the The sight of his neighbors standing united made the damage feel worth it. A community rebuilt. The local sheriff arrived shortly after, this time with a determined look in his eye. The evidence Jack and his neighbors had collected, combined with the captured gang leader, left no room for leniency. Vince and several other members of the Iron Vultures were arrested on the spot, facing charges ranging from vandalism to extortion and assault. As the police secured the scene, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, tentatively stepping into the glow of the porch lights. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, the oppressive fear that had gripped the town finally lifting. Over the following weeks, Jack and the neighborhood came together to repair the damage left by the gang's reign of terror. Megan hosted fundraisers at her diner to cover the costs of repairs, and Tom, the retired officer, worked with local officials to ensure the gang wouldn't return. Jack, true to his nature, remained at the center of the efforts, offering his tools and expertise to anyone who needed them. Jack's reflection. One quiet evening, Jack stood on his porch, looking out over the yard he had spent years cultivating. His home, though battered, still stood tall, a testament to his resilience and the strength of a community that refused to back down. Raising his gaze, Jack caught sight of a new American flag fluttering proudly in the breeze. The neighbors had surprised him with it, presenting it as a symbol of their gratitude and solidarity. For the first time in years, Jack felt a deep sense of purpose and belonging. As he took a sip from his coffee mug, the faint sound of children laughing in the distance brought a rare smile to his face. The town was healing, and so was he. Though the battle had taken its toll, Jack knew he had reclaimed more than just his home. He had helped restore hope to a community that now stood stronger together. "They won't forget us now," he murmured to himself, watching the flag wave under the stars. And with that, Jack turned back inside, ready to embrace the quiet life he had fought so hard to protect.